Today we're going to be talking about APIA overview with Mr. Brian Ayers and Mr. Ben Nichols. So without further ado, I present Ben and Brian.
Thank you very much, Jackie. So first I want to talk about what we're going to take a look at today. We're going to discuss what is APIA, and probably what most of you are here for. You want to see what the product actually looks like, so we'll take a look at the product. We'll explain how we got here, kind of what culminated to make APIA such a valuable tool in the invoice approval process. We'll take a look at the approval overview in APIA, so what the end users actually see when they're approving and how we can set that up. We'll also take a look at the typical implementation process, what that looks like and kind of what our methodology has been in the past. And we'll look at some of the results and feedback we've gotten from some of our customers that are actually using APIA. So first to start, what is APIA? It stands for Accounts Payable Invoice Automation. So it's part of Infor's landmark financial apps. It's an add-on to Lawson AP. It kind of sits in front of that process. You integrate your invoice processing directly with Lawson Financial system. It's a simplified invoice entry, review, and approval. So it's basically a workflow for getting non-PO approvals done and service POs. You have the security and routing based on the customer-defined roles and rules within the application. It gives you faster access and more complete invoice information. So as we'll see today, it gives you a really good view into the invoice lifecycle and how invoices move through the system. It's very customizable, so we have role-based access for processors, approvers, managers, and administrators. APIA kind of ships with those basic roles. You can add more and customize those if you need to, but a lot of our customers have done pretty good just using the out-of-the-box roles that are provided. So in summary, it's a workflow tool that we can use for routing invoices around, for collecting approvals on those invoices, either adding GL distributions or just getting approvals for service invoices. It's a front-end AP entry tool for entering invoices, similar like how you would into AP20. You can enter invoices and key them directly into APIA, and it gives you the tool to manage those unreleased invoices. So any invoices that aren't complete in your system ready to pay, you can kind of manage them from within APIA. So APIA, some of the good feedback we get from our customers is that the entry process for the AP staff is very streamlined. When you look at the screens when you're keying an invoice into AP20, key the invoice into AP20, it's going to bounce you to another screen to do some of your add-on costs, take you to another screen to do your line matching, all that. So there's a bunch of different screens involved within Lawson to process an invoice. APIA kind of streamlines that process for us, and you can pretty much do all your entry in one place. So the screen we're looking at here is basically what your invoice entry screen looks like. You have the ability to enter in all the same data you would into AP20, but across the top there you have your different tabs. So if you have any comments, add-on costs, if you put in a PO number, you get all your PO line information displayed there. So it's all displayed in one location for you. This form is very customizable too. If we need to add buttons to the forms, if we need to move any of the fields around, it's all very customizable. But out of the box, our customers have been pretty happy with the product as is.
Very much so. A nice thing about this screen too is it actually has the addition of a comment section, so both the processors and approvers can leave comments on the invoice, and it follows the invoice through the life cycle, both from entry all the way through approval and past being approved and even paid. So you can see some of those comments on what's been done to the invoice, why some steps were taken and such through the entire life cycle. So next up, we've got our invoice management console. This is kind of your command center for APIA. This is where a processor will be able to both enter an invoice, add data points to the invoice, and also where they can see the statuses of the invoice through its life cycle. So what we can see on the left side is we've got some statuses such as unassigned, unsubmitted, and such. So we'll walk through those here in just a second. But to the right, we've got some buttons that help us kind of work the invoice. So once it comes into APIA, what we saw in the previous screen was the invoice entry. And in order to access that, we do have a create option. It's that page option all the way to the right on the top there. We also have the ability to assign a AP processor. Email invoices, it allows the ability to send invoice data and the invoice image out to either the approvers or processors or just about anyone with an email address. Next up, we have the ability to see some additional information associated with the invoice. So if it came from an imaging solution such as MHC or OnBase, we could see some of the scanned information for that invoice. We also have the ability, based on permissions, to cancel the invoice. This will actually put it into a cancellation status, and we'll talk about that a little bit more here shortly. And then you have the ability to open, delete, save, and also search the invoice from within inside of this screen. Going back to the left-hand side where we have our statuses, we'll go ahead and start off with unassigned. So unassigned provides a kind of state that lets us know that a AP processor has not been assigned to the invoice. Part of the functionality for APIA, we define something called an assignment rule within inside of the solution. And this assignment rule helps us define who this invoice is going to be owned by from an AP standpoint. This is the AP processor that would be responsible for entering in key data points to get the invoice ready for approval and also determine if the invoice is prepared to be sent into Lawson for payment. Once we actually have a processor assigned, so in the event that a rule was triggered that auto-assigns it, or we've initiated a manual assignment of the AP processor, the invoice would then be in an unsubmitted state. Our unsubmitted state represents an invoice that has a few data points that needs to be changed or edited in order to prepare it to be sent through the approval process. So from within inside the unsubmitted area, this is where a processor would likely be working a lot of their invoices. The goal is to try and get as many invoices assigned automatically to processors as possible during design and configuration. That way we can make the process more efficient for the end users. The next status we have is our pending approval status. This status allows for to show a state of the invoice being in the approval process. So once an invoice moves from unsubmitted and is sent for approval, it actually goes through our backend out-of-the-box AP approval for the invoice approval flow. So this is an IPA flow. And that assigns out based on the routing rules that are defined within inside of the system out to the approver within inside of the approval structure. So once it's out for approval, from a processor's perspective, they can see this item within inside of APIA. Next up, after we've run through the approval process, which we'll be providing an example here shortly of, we actually have the invoice moved into an approved state. In some configurations and for some business processes, if an invoice is approved, it is fully ready to integrate into S3, which means that it's available within inside of Lawson. But there's also the option to actually make the invoice stop and have a processor review it prior to submitting into Lawson. Our next state is our rejected state. This allows an invoice to be rejected during the approval process in the event that there is an issue with the invoice or a data point needs to be corrected. Next up, we have our sent for payment. This indicates that the invoice has been interfaced into Lawson and is now accessible within inside of the Lawson environment. Next up, we have our paid, and this is an indication that the invoice has been paid from Lawson. That information is sent back into APIA and allows the processor to see, again, a new state for the invoice. Last but not least, for our statuses is our canceled status. Now this is a little bit different from our rejections, and the reason being is a canceled status allows us to store the invoice within inside of APIA in the event that a duplicate is sent the next month or a duplicate invoice number is sent at any point in time. This assists in ensuring that we prevent duplicates, and so it stores the item there. Next up, we've got our search section, and our search section allows several key data points within inside of the invoice, such as invoice number, invoice amount, invoice date, to allow us to search for invoices within inside of the solution. We can also see all the statuses that we've talked about on the left within inside of the search section, and this helps for review and research to identify where an invoice is at within inside of the life cycle.
just to piggyback a little bit on what Ben said, the grid view that we're looking at here is fully customizable. So you can reorder your columns, you can slide things around. A cool feature within APIA is the ability, if you have a grid or you do a search and you save a search for like a status type by a company or something like that, you can just right click and you can export that whole grid out to a CSV file. So you don't have to have someone develop you a custom report or anything to get that data. To whatever data you put in the grid, it'll export right out to the CSV. Think we have a question?
Yeah, we do. We have a question about entering purchase order invoices or match invoices into APIA, specifically when it comes to entering the detail lines. The question is, when you enter the PO and the PO lines come up, are they just the lines off the receiver?
So we don't have a screenshot of that, but basically when you enter in a PO number, you'll get a tab for the PO lines, and you can basically go in. It's not just the receiver. You're basically entering. You want to enter in the lines as they relate to the invoice itself. So it'll show you all the lines on the PO. It'll show you the open quantities for those lines that haven't been received or matched yet, and you pretty much enter in those values there.
So you could enter in an invoice detail lines even if the line has not yet been received.
Yes.
Which
correct.
would allow you to get that invoice into the system and use the system's exception handling rather than being stuck with an unenterable invoice.
Exactly.
Correct.
So when you enter that invoice, it's still going to interface out of APIA because the invoice itself is okay. We just haven't received anything against it yet. So when it goes into S3 and you have your matching programs run to go out and try to match those invoices, that's when you'll handle all the exceptions basically with your matching at that point. So your matching process is still the same. Nothing changes really with the matching process.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so let's take a look at how we got here. So what brought about APIA? So APIA is the culmination of AP automation and innovation. I think we're going to do that too. So what brought about APIA? So auditing of the invoice approval process is needed. So back in the day, you'd just shuffle paper around, people would get signatures, you'd have your signature book that you'd compare signatures for to make sure an invoice was actually approved by the correct person and signature matched. So we need a much better way to handle invoices than doing that. So poor visibility into the invoice lifecycle, not knowing where invoices are in the process. You have vendors call and want to know where their invoice is, and you don't know whose desk it's sitting on. So a slow data entry process. So keying in data for the processors themselves takes a long time to enter in that information. And then clunky end user interfaces. So the folks that are actually approving invoices need a nice way to go in and approve invoices. It's 2017, approvers kind of deserve that now. So what I want to do is kind of look at two examples that we have customers that use today, and kind of show how those two examples kind of come together to make APIA and kind of get us to where we're at now. So our first example here, we'll call it the BlackBerry example. So back in the early 2000s, BlackBerry is where it's at. And this is kind of the process that we were implementing at the time for invoice approvals. You'd have a document imaging system. You scan invoices into that document imaging system. And then you build some sort of workflow in that system to send the invoices out for coding and approval. So that's great because it gave you a way to track the invoice approval process, see who it's going to, enforce some business rules, and things like that. So that was nice, and it gets rid of the paper. So you're not going to have stacks of paper on people's desks. You're not going to try to figure out a backlog of invoices by how tall your stack of paper is that you're trying to key in. So it gives you a lot more visibility in the process. So that was a great first step. Also gives you the ability to generate accrual reports. So you could go out and develop a custom report out of your document management system that would give you your accruals. So that's also nice. But so there's some downsides to having that set up like that. So if you have a third-party system that sits outside of Lawson or Infor, then you're going to have some data integrity issues. So you're having to do nightly extracts to pull data out of Lawson. There's always the chance that your vendor file is going to get out of whack. If you're doing PO information out of there, that's constantly changing, and things like that. So you're dealing with another system and a whole other set of interfaces, which give you a whole bunch of breakpoints for your data integrity. So another example, which is another step in the right direction, we'll call this one our two-way pager example. You have invoices that are being entered directly into Lawson. So you just have one system of record. It's all in Lawson. The approvers are collected within Lawson itself. So you're using a tool like a process flow or something similar to what you would do for requisitioning to approve those invoices as they come through Lawson. So this definitely gives you some additional benefits. You're all in one system. If you go to key in an invoice into AP 20, if you're going to enter the header and it's a duplicate, you can't enter it. It won't let you enter it. So you're going to catch those right up front. All your vendor information is live because you're right in your system of record doing that work. But the downsides to that, for anyone that's managed process flows, they're a little clunky. Typically someone in AP isn't going to be managing that flow, so if you need to make any changes to it, it's going to be out to IT, it's going to turn into a project. It's just a lot of work to kind of maintain that structure, that approval structure, or make any changes to it. It's very technical. The other thing is that you get partial invoice records created. So if you're creating records in AP 20 that don't have coding, or that you're creating them and putting a hold code on them because they need to be routed out for approval, you have partial records out there. So you really need to work that unreleased invoices report, make sure that you don't have just invoice records out there that kind of get orphaned and left. So it's a little tricky to kind of have partially created invoices within your system. So APIA kind of gives us the best of both worlds. So this will be our iPhone 10 model. So it's a one-stop shop for your invoice entry, your approvals, your processing. It's a very flexible approval process. We'll talk about that a little bit more, and we'll show you some examples of what it looks like. But as Ben mentioned, you have an IPA flow that kind of runs in the back to do all your approvals. But with the tools that Infor has given you, you can, by the way you set up your routing hierarchy, you can manipulate that flow and set up approvals so that you can work them within the user interface and not have to modify the flow to change your approval process. Yep. So easy accruals. So you're in Infor already. So the accruals are easy. So you're getting that aspect. And then the user interface, as you've seen the screens before and the ones we'll see here going forward, is really kind of slick and nice for the approvers and all the users.
Yeah, a lot more condensed from the original 4 or 5 screens that you had.
Exactly. Yep. Okay, so where does APIA fit into the invoice lifecycle? So we typically recommend still that you have some sort of data capture tool on the front end to help automate your AP process. So whether that's OnBase, Kofax, ReadSoft, Image Express, any of the front end data capture tools that'll extract some of your data off for you and then have that interface into APIA. That's very helpful. It's optional though in this process. And then you have APIA kind of sitting in front of Lawson Financials so that once the invoices are completed in APIA and processed, then they move on to Lawson Financials. So what kind of invoices work in APIA? All of them do. Some get more benefits than others, but you can run all of your invoices through APIA. So if you have PO invoices, you'd still run those through like we talked about through APIA. You do all your line pairing within APIA if you wanted to do that. But then your non-PO invoices, your items that might require some additional workflow, that's really where you're going to get the benefit of APIA and having that workflow set up. So you have your non-PO approval structure, your hierarchy throughout your company that you can build out in there. And then your service POs, they can either follow the same path as your non-POs or you can build a completely different approval structure for those. Okay, so let's take a look at how do you get invoice data into APIA. So you can do it through web services. So if you want to have one of those third-party data capture tools, you can build some interfaces between those to create the invoice records. If you want to import a flat file, if you have a CSV file or text file you want to import, you could use an APIA flow to do that. For those of you familiar with Spreadsheet Designer, you can use that also to import those types of files. Spreadsheet Designer is basically the new version of Lawson add-ins. It's just an Excel-based connector into Lawson. So you can use that to import records as well into the Landmark application. And then you have your good old-fashioned data manual entry. So you can still have the paper and key that in if you'd like. So imaging integration options. There's a few different ways we can treat images within APIA. If you're going to be sending invoices out for approval, those approvers are going to want to see the images. So you're going to need a way to have those images available to you within APIA. You can have a local copy of the image stored within APIA, and if you do that, it gives you the ability to route, or when the email goes out for approvals, you have the ability to have that as an attachment, so you can see it, and we'll see an example of that actually in the next slide. But it gives you the ability to see that attachment when you send it out. And it's not really intended to be an image repository. That image does get associated with the invoice as it goes through the life cycle. But most of our customers are still going to have a back-end repository to kind of store your images. But having that actual image file in APIA does help and makes the visibility a little bit easier. APIA also has out-of-the-box setup to a lot of the major document imaging vendors. So Perceptive Content, OnBase, MHC, MH Express, Bassware, they have basically a button that you can connect directly to those imaging systems. So it's pretty out of the box to get those set up, and not a lot of work to set that up to give you the image link there.
And then going back to the other imaging platforms that aren't out of the box, what can be done there?
So you can add, if you have the ability basically to create a button on the screen there, so you could just pass in the document URL that you'd have from your system that would pop it up for you. So anything, if you have a document imaging system that's not listed here, and there's other ones besides these that are already have connectors built, it's pretty easy just to build a generic button to bring up that image. Good point.
Yeah, so we're going to show an example now of what an approval process kind of looks like for the end users, for the approvers. And we're going to start off with the approval email that can be sent out. Now this is optional. You can get an approval email. You can also get rejection emails as well. So in the event that a invoice is rejected, you can get a notification for that. But on our screen, we have the approval email. Kind of some basic aspects to it. The subject line, we have the ability to enter in some key data points associated with the invoice, such as the invoice number or name, and then the vendor number or name associated with it. Below that, we have the actual invoice attachment, just like Brian was mentioning previously, when you store that document locally, and if you're getting that provided from an imaging software, we then have the ability to include that. And it is also optional, so you can configure that with inside of the solution. So in the body of the email, we've got some basic data points as well, including invoice number, invoice amount, and invoice date. But if you make your way all the way to the bottom of the email, we'll actually see that there's a click here link. This actually allows the approver to access the APIA approval process and the actual ability to approve the invoice from a web-based interface. And so if we go to the next slide, we'll show a quick example of the invoice image from within inside of the email. So the attachment's directly linked there. And then if we go ahead and jump over to the next slide, we've got our APIA web approval. So on this screen, after we log in, we use our Lawson credentials in order to get into this screen. We see the actual user is myself currently, and then at the very bottom of the screen, we have our work items. Now, when an invoice enters into the approval process, it actually triggers the creation of a work item, which is then sent out as part of this invoice approval process. And then if we were to actually select the item at the bottom, it would open up the invoice for us. But before we do that, we're going to actually go over to our next slide, and we're going to show an additional tab within inside of this screen, which is our historical window. And this is going to provide us information on any invoice that has been approved by this user. So we'll see a bunch of examples of vendors and invoices within inside of this screen. If we go all the way to the right, we have the ability to view the image if the image is actually linked to that invoice. We also have the ability to see the status of the invoice. So if we have an approval structure that has both me and Brian in it, I'm the first one who's approved it, and it's now in Brian's court to approve, we may see a status of pending approval from this screen. We can also see if an invoice has been rejected and any of the other states that were included within inside of our previous slides. But this is kind of helpful for a historical view. I think we have a question.
Yeah, a question regarding email notifications.
Okay.
If an approver has 50 invoices to approve, would our approver receive 50 emails or one email with a listing of the 50 invoices?
So the way the system's configured currently, it is one email per invoice. That is what makes the email notification optional. There is also the ability to approve invoices with inside of Rich Client, and so if in the event you're not using the web-based approach, you can actually see the listing there, but from a notification standpoint, there's not an option to consolidate the total amount of invoices that are out for an approver. It's one invoice per email, or one email per invoice.
If a customer did want to have only a consolidated notification, you'd suggest turning off the instant emails that are built into APIA, and instead using a separate notification, for example, LBI Smart Notification, or an email generated from an IPA flow that's run in batch, and then would consolidate all that information in one place.
Yeah.
Correct.
Just have that run on a schedule. Yeah, so it goes out. Yeah, just one email a day, so you're not getting completely bombarded. Yeah, you can configure that.
Yeah, we do have some customers that the preference is there's already enough emails in the inbox, so they definitely want to go the direction of disabling the notification in that aspect.
Yeah, people tend to ignore emails if they're seeing so many come in a single day. So
yeah. We have one other question at this time. As an AP processor, can we see everything that is awaiting approval, no matter which approver it is waiting on?
You do have this functionality. So with inside of APIA, based on roles and privileges, you can either see all of the invoices or you can see just the ones assigned to you. So it's important to note that from different areas within inside of the system, you may get two different views. Part of the reasoning behind this is to make sure that when you log in as a processor, you have just the items you have to work, and then you also have the ability to see all of the items regardless of who's logged into the system. From within that pending approval queue, if you are viewing it with a privilege set to be able to see all the items, you would be able to see data points such as who's assigned to it from a processor standpoint, and then who the current approver is. There's actually a nifty functionality within inside of it as well that you can click on a link and it'll open up the entire approval structure to let you see who the approver is and who the next approver may be.
And one other question on this topic. How will the email notifications change with CSF, Cloud Suite Financials? Will the notification actually go to the user's email or just show up in the CSF notification area?
So I don't think we've encountered this one yet. We might actually have to take that question, do some research, and provide an answer back specifically.
Okay, great. I would venture to guess that you have either of those options of sending an actual email as well as using that Mingle 12 notification area. But we will research and get back to you. Thank you.
Yep.
All right, continuing on.
Okay.
Awesome. So what we're going to go through now is an actual example of opening up that work item or that invoice approval. And what we'll see here is the screen that presents the basic invoice data points. So we've got, again, the invoice amount, invoice date, and such. And this allows the approver to see both the invoice itself, the data points associated, and then from our tab 2 tabs over is our related documents section. And this is where we actually can access the invoice image associated. So they can see the data and the invoice image together when they're approving. So up top, if we kind of start from the top and work our way down, we have the approve, reject, and reassign button. We'll talk about that functionality here in just a moment. And then we've got tabs that allow us to see the invoice header level data, the distribution lines, the related documents, and then we have an errors tab and an approval history. From our distribution section, we do have the ability to just show whatever distributions have already been coded on the invoice, but there's also configurations that can potentially allow the coding of distributions as an approver as well. In our related documents section, we'll show any related documents with this invoice. Specifically, this is going to be the invoice image. And then from our errors section, this will show us any data points that need to be corrected on the invoice or anything that is remaining to be resolved prior to interfacing into Lawson. Some examples for this could be if there's a missing data point like invoice amount, or if the distribution lines don't total the invoice amount. Last but not least, in our approval history section, we'll actually see the same kind of information we saw in the previous slide for historical view, and it'll show us who is approved, what they've approved for this invoice, and if any rejections or routing has occurred as well. At the very bottom of this header level screen that we see on our screen right now, there's an option to actually reassign the approval. What this means is it will actually go out to the approval structure that's defined. So for example, if Brian is a level 2 approver and I'm level 1, and I know this invoice needs to go to Brian before I touch it or just needs to go to him regardless, I can actually select this drop down and select Brian as the approver, and then up top we have the reassign button. So we'd enter our reassignment level. A comment is required on why I'm assigning this to Brian. So maybe this invoice amount is outside the threshold that I have approval. So I'll send it to Brian. I'll click the reassign button and it'll immediately send this over to Brian. Next up, we've got our approver in a reject. So in a rejection state, we would select the button, a pop-up would appear for us, and then we would have to select something called a rejection reason. Now, a rejection reason is defined during design. We kind of have a conversation around what kind of reasons would we need to reject an invoice. For example, let's say that we don't want to pay this invoice, so we're going to say there's a no pay rejection reason. So we would reject, select no pay rejection, and then the system actually requires a comment on it. That way a processor knows once the invoice is back in their queue why it's being rejected and what next steps might need to occur. Last but not least, we have our approval button, and this is going to just approve the invoice. Once clicked, it'll save the invoice, close out of the screen, and move on as part of the approval process. So that's where the approval flow will be initiated. Double check to make sure all approvals have been assigned and approved. And then if everything is completed, we'd then see this move to a completely approved state inside of the processor's management console. And then they would be able to either review the invoice or, depending on configurations, it may directly interface into Lawson.
I think the only thing I would add too is on the approval history tab, you do get you can see all the approvals that were made in the past, everyone that's touched it during the approval process. So if there's any question, making sure somebody's seen it before it gets finally approved, you can click in there and just take a look at it. Question?
Question. Does this then replace the current in-basket? And would managers go to a different place to approve invoices rather than the current S3 in-basket today?
So the in-basket is a part of this process as well. So if you were to log into Rich Client or have access to your in-basket from different areas inside of Lawson, you would still see your work item from within there as well. So what we've gone through today is the web-based approval process, but there's also a Rich Client-based approval process, and you can actually use the in-basket, so that work item would exist there as well. You'll see a very similar screen to this one with the approve, reject, and reassign. It just might look a little bit more geared towards that framework.
Okay, great, thanks. Another question here. When the invoice is completely approved, is it an automatic process to move into Lawson, or do you have to batch them out every day to move to Lawson?
So it is not necessarily batched out. There's actually a configuration set inside of APIA that helps determine whether you want the invoice to automatically route as soon as it's approved into Lawson, or you uncheck that configuration set and it stops for a processor to actually review the item and then manually click a send for payment, which would then interface the item into Lawson.
Yep. Okay. But not a batch. So either way you do that, either AP is reviewing it on the back end or not, but it's going to transfer over as soon as either the approvers approved it or AP has final approved it.
All right. And one more question on this screen. Can you remove the reassign to approval level option?
You cannot. That's not configurable right outside of the box for the web interface. There is always the option with Infor to enter in enhancements, and we have done that in the past before where we request functionality like that. But out of the box, that is not removable.
Yeah. And we have actually had a customer ask for that, so that is a good question.
I think we have one more.
Yeah, one question. We have a lot of great questions coming in. A question regarding how the system determines the approver for a particular invoice, and stop me if you guys are going to cover this later. With invoice approval, can AP assign the approval based on the department number if it's coded to, versus actually choosing an approver's name?
Yeah, so it's really, during our design, we'll get into kind of our implementation methodology and what we look at during different steps in the implementation, but during our design, that's exactly what we need to determine, basically, how you do your approvals. I think a typical scenario that we would run into is you'd set up basically a routing, they call them route categories within APIA for each department or cost center. And then the AP staff, whether they're selecting it within APIA or if it's in the document capture software, would basically pick the route category that corresponds to the invoice. Yeah. So in a perfect world of non-PO invoice routing, we would have our vendors put on like a company counting unit combination on the invoice. Yep. When that comes in, then we know exactly where it routes. But that being said, you do have the option of building your approvals kind of by user if you really want to. You can do that. So it's very customizable. And those changes, those types of changes to the approval structure don't require a process flow update or anything. That's all within when you build out your routing categories, you build out your routing rules, things like that. It's all within the GUI basically of APIA. You're not having to customize a flow to do that.
Yep. All right, great.
Awesome. Okay.
So, okay. You want to go ahead on this one? You got this.
Okay. So we want to take a look at what an implementation of APIA looks like. So who is the APIA for? Really, any customer that's on version 10 could implement APIA. If you're in the cloud, chances are APIA is already part of your Cloud Suite subscription. If you're not currently licensed for APIA, so if you're not on the cloud, if you don't already have access to it, give us a call and we can help you kind of navigate those discussions with Infor to see what your options are. If you're a Cloud Suite and financials and supply management, once we get to that point, actually AP20 kind of goes away. APIA is going to be your front end for invoice entry into the financial system.
Question here, just to clarify, APIA sits on Landmark, but can communicate with S3 if we still have AP on S3 today?
Exactly. Yes. Yep. So it's a Landmark application that already has the built-in hooks back into S3. So as soon as the invoices are processed, all those connections are out of the box and automatic. So yeah. But yeah, when you do get up to the Cloud Suite financials though, and everything kind of lives on Landmark at that point, you could do this ahead of that process, and you'll kind of be a little bit ahead of the curve when it comes time to do that. Yeah. So our typical timeline for an implementation that we've seen, it's going to vary depending on your organization, obviously, but around 3 months to implement. Our steps of implementation are kind of similar through different projects, but the design, your build, we typically like to have a conference room pilot, training, user acceptance testing, and then a go live. So let's dig into each of those a little bit more and go over what they cover.
Yeah, so for our designs, what we really like to do is we like to be on site to take some time to meet directly with the teams. This can include your AP team and your IT team as well. We like to kick it off by reviewing the current business processes. That way we have a good understanding of where we're coming from, a good starting point. That way when we finish up the project, we can see where we started and where we're at now. Next up, we like to standardize and talk through the approval process. So sometimes we come into organizations and there's already a standardized approval process in place, and then it's just a matter of, making sure that correctly with inside of APIA. And
this is a good time though, if you're implementing APIA, if you need to standardize that process, this is a good time to revisit that and get other folks on board and get bought into the standard approval process.
And it plays a big part both in implementation down the road as well for maintenance, because when you have that standardized approval process, it minimizes the amount of work you have to do later on to kind of determine, hey, we've got this new team, this new group that's going to need approvals in here, and you've already got the structure. You can just kind of plug and play. From there, we've got define the use cases, and use cases and test scenarios kind of go hand in hand. We have a template that we provide during design that kind of helps formulate what we need to be testing the system for, what we need to ensure is directly functioning for each invoice. Maybe different companies flow a little differently. And we kind of help guide the conversations around this and get those defined. That way when we get to UAT and we get to testing, we have a clear path of what needs to be tested and how it needs to function. That way when we're ready to go live, we can look to that test case scenario and say, hey, did we get sign off? Did we test everything we needed? That way we're more prepared for go live. Last but not least, in the design section, we kind of do a security review. We take a scan to see whether approvers have been set up inside of Lawson, if there are any permission sets that need to be changed, and just kind of get a good idea of what to anticipate during implementation.
Yeah, if there's any of the out-of-the-box security roles that aren't going to fit or need to be tweaked, we need to kind of map that out at that point.
Yep.
So for the build phase, we need to build in any of the integrations to your document imaging systems. So if you have a system that's going to be bringing invoices into APIA, we need to kind of look at that interface, as well as the lookups, the going out to bring in the images as well. Typically, we're going to build this out in your test or dev environment first. We'll build out based on the design results. We'll come back and kind of build out your routing rules, your assignment rules, and the security set up within APIA. And that's kind of what we're going to use to drive all the approval structure and everything. And then any custom reports that need to be built during this process. As I mentioned before, a lot of the basic reporting you can almost do via searching within APIA and have those exported. But if there's other accrual type reports or anything fancy you need to do, we do it during the build phase here.
Yeah, there is a lot of the grids that we were talking about in those examples. So if you see a list with inside of those, all of those items can be exported out to CSV. So we have some data dumps in where you just right click, export to CSV, and then you can filter and sort through Excel functionality. So one of the things we also like to do is a conference room pilot. And kind of what this helps us do is it helps us validate the configurations that we designed. Helps kind of do an end-to-end process with the AP processors and the AP team to get a feel for the software. Start to see things in action and see if it's really going to accomplish the business processes that are needed by the organization. It's an overall kind of will the design work for us. Kind of helps answer the questions of, visually, what are we getting? How is it going to work? What's it going to look like? And then last but not least, it helps us know if there's any gaps, anything that we need to address or tweak in order to ensure that the business.
Yeah, before we really dive into the testing and training, we want to do a conference room pilot first, make sure all the stakeholders are on board and that it looks good and it's what you expected out of the design before we really roll it out.
Yep.
And I'll let you do the training.
Sounds good.
Do the training.
So we've got some training options. We like to be on site for training with the AP staff. This basically allows us to be there, answer any questions firsthand, walk through it together. It's kind of a follow-up to the conference room pilot, but gets more in depth, make sure that we answer any kind of one-off business processes. How would this look with inside of the system? Next option we have is training for approvers. We can do this remotely. It can also be done during the on-site as well. And then last but not least, we do have some pre-recorded training videos. What we like to do with our WebExes for our customers is we like to record them regardless. That way we can provide them for access later for people who weren't able to participate or just follow up. It's also important to note that we've been working at RPI Consulting to provide APIA web series, which is going to be some videos available on our YouTube channel. Look forward to marketing, emailing out some materials to your organization for follow-up on that, and that will include some walkthroughs of the system, some different functionalities available inside of APIA, and then ultimately our goal down the road is to try to actually implement some training videos that can be accessed as well.
And usually while we're on site for the training, we kind of like to kick off the user acceptance testing, so the UAT phase of the implementation. So this is where we're going to test all those design scenarios, all the scenarios we came up with during design. We definitely want to do end-to-end full lifecycle tests of everything. So from the time the document's scanned, goes out from approvals, moves into S3, and then we actually cut a check. So we want to go all the way through the process and make sure that everything's working. We usually involve all the AP staff with this step and make sure that everyone is comfortable and likes what's been built. Typically after the user acceptance, we're going to have a few things that we need to tweak, but by this point, once we've gotten through the conference room pilot, it's usually nothing major, just some small changes that we might need to make. And then we basically want to determine what those changes are and anything that is required before we actually go live. And so once we make those changes and we're ready to go live, we'd like to come back on site. So that's really three points for our design, the training, and then our go live. We'd like to be back on site. Some nice things about an APIA go live. It's very low risk. So there's no data connections needed or conversions needed. So you're not bringing in invoice information really from another system because you're already on Infor Lawson. Yep. And there's no legacy functionality that's lost. Yeah. So you go live with APIA and you want to go key an invoice into AP20, knock yourself out. You can go do it.
You can.
Yeah, you can. So you're not really losing any of that legacy functionality. So. Okay, so results of implementing APIA. What we've seen with our customers that have gone live with APIA and that are using it is that the APIA processing time, or the invoice processing times, are reduced. So invoices are making it through the system faster. You have a lot more visibility into it. The customer satisfaction is increased. So, so approvers are happy. They're getting nice emails when they need to do their approvals. They like the approval screen. Entering in GL distributions is easy. They like how that all works. The vendors are happy because if they're calling and asking where an invoice is, you know where it is. You don't know it's lost on somebody else's desk, or you're having them send you another copy and you're scanning in a duplicate, so they're happy. And then the processors, the actual AP staff. Yep. We get a lot of feedback from the actual folks in AP that are processing invoices, having to manage exceptions within APIA and correct issues or change things on invoices. It's a lot better interface. It's a lot cleaner and easier for them to process invoices. Yep. And as we said many times, just the greater visibility into the life cycle, just seeing where an invoice is at every step of the process is very helpful. Yep. Okay. Any other questions that we didn't get to?
Yes, we have a question here. Can you go over how the approval hierarchy would get updated?
Yeah,
good question.
So the approval hierarchy, when we first implement it, we typically actually get a structure. There's a template to input who's going to be the approval one for what data points. So let's say we use department as an example to identify who the approver is. We have the ability, so that template will actually be structured to upload through Spreadsheet Designer. So you can upload it from Spreadsheet Designer. The other option is you can go directly into APIA, and there's configurations inside of APIA to directly input the changes. So if we need to add an approver, if we need to take an approver out and switch it out for someone else, you can add it inside of APIA, or you can go through the back end, use an Excel spreadsheet template, and upload through Spreadsheet Designer.
Yeah, so if you're doing mass changes, I mean, you basically just format it in Excel and then upload it through Spreadsheet Designer, and yeah, it's pretty easy to make large changes like that. Yep.
Can APIA be installed on S3, or is it only a landmark application? Is it an application like contract management or talent management?
So it's a landmark application. So it's got to be on landmark, like contract management.
So like contract management or talent management, APIA is part of a bundle called the Landmark Financial Applications, like close-end recon, treasury management. Those applications bundle into a module that installs into Landmark. So yeah, you would need to have a Landmark application server as part of your Lawson environment for to support this. Question, I think this goes back to the approval hierarchy. Is the approval hierarchy maintained manually, or is there an interface from the HR system?
So there's not an interface built, but you can use your HR system. If you have that structure out there, you can use the same structure if you want. You could either grab that and bring it into APIA, but then you're kind of managing it in 2 locations. But you could start with that if you wanted to. Or if you did build a custom approval flow, you could just reference that hierarchy. But it doesn't directly plug into the out-of-the-box approval structure.
So you're saying that you could replace the built-in approval flow with an IPA flow that maybe uses the HRTM user action node, since we know that IPA does integrate with our HR supervisor structure.
Yep.
And on that note, related question, API invoice approval does not use PFI user profile, PFI task, and PFI task category business classes. So that's a lot of acronyms. I believe that what we're getting at is tasks in IPA, right? You know, like tasks and categories, which is a common way that requisition approval is set up. APIA doesn't use those, right?
No, it doesn't use those directly.
No, not with the built-in flow. Again, you could replace the built-in approval flow with a custom IPA flow, in which case the world is your oyster. But
exactly. If you have a requisitioning flow that you like, you can basically use the same structure if you'd like. Yeah.
Okay, great. Lawson 10, is there a particular minimum version of Lawson 10 that a customer would need to be at to use APIA?
I do not believe so. I think we might need to check to make sure, but I don't believe so.
Yeah. Any real modern apps version in version 10 you should be safe with. And then as far as the technology foundation, just as a general guidance, RPI would recommend doing a Lawson technology update prior to an APIA implementation. We are big fans of Landmark version 11, and we think that a project such as this would benefit from doing a bit of a refresh on the technology side and getting up to Landmark 11, which has a prerequisite of LSF 1009. Happy to follow up on that offline if there are any questions there. Stand by here. Spreadsheet Designer. Here a question. Is Spreadsheet Designer an application outside of Lawson that must be purchased and configured for Excel?
It is an add-in that can be downloaded from Infor Extreme, right? Your Infor account?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there is any additional cost for Spreadsheet Designer.
Okay, so there is a licensing requirement similar to add-ins.
Okay.
But yeah, let's say it's very similar to the Excel query wizard in terms of install and deployment. We don't want to wade too deep into licensing details because, of course, that Infor account, your Infor account exec would always be the authority on what the software licensing is going to look like. I have one more question here. This one's regarding EDI. Can you import EDI 810s into APIA?
We haven't.
Think we could use the flat file process
I don't know if you
IPA
would,
flow?
I don't know if you would need to, I guess. If there'd be benefit to doing that.
Right. That's an excellent point. Is if you chances are your EDI 810s are for three-way match invoices, and there's not a huge benefit to pipelining them through APIA because they're really just going to hopefully auto match.
Exactly. Yeah.
I guess if you were not doing a three-way match, I think it would be. I don't think there's an out-of-the-box function for EDI 810 import, but I could see potentially making use of the EDI translation engine that's part of the EDI module to convert from EDI format to say an MA540 format, and then having an IPA flow pick that up. We've also seen customers who wish to have a fake image for an EDI invoice. So you could incorporate an image renderer into that process. So that way you'd have a picture of an invoice to route around and take a look at associated with that record. So that would all be possible, but it would be a development to enhance the solution, not necessarily out of the box functionality.